UBDS. So our work here is really about implementing data and AI systems across highly regulated industries. So that's actually 70–80% public sector, and the rest of that is largely in financial services. So really working from what is the strategy to then finding the best technology vendors for our partnerships, also with Microsoft, AWS, and Databricks, to then actually implement. So I have a background in technical roles in business intelligence and data science, but now in my current role, it's really leading the approach with the team and working with our data engineers, architects, data scientists, as well as with the product owners and tech leadership to make sure that the solutions that we're building are really delivering value, but also have that long-term maintenance, so that that is really embedded within the organization, whether that means bringing people on the journey, upskilling them to take it over, or actually to run it ourselves, but having that continuous feedback with users. So whilst we do start with the strategy, we really get into the weeds of delivery. And I think that's the part that I personally love, is actually seeing what it takes to make that change. Because when we talk about data and I guess technology more broadly, it's not so much about having the right tools, but it's how do you actually make them work in the context of your organization, of the legacy, of the politics, of the budgets. How do you actually pull those threads together to make data an asset and really protect it as well? So today I want to explore a particular question. Many people are talking about medallion as a best practice architecture, but what does it actually take to make that a success? So this is just a little overview of some of the areas that we touch on. So really starting on the cloud, data and analytics. I want to jump straight into the story here and tell it through the lens of a case study. So for Imperial College London, they're an organization that actually have a legacy since over 100 years and manage a massive income of over 1.3 billion. It has a large number of alumni, 250,000, where it manages that network, and it has to track that all the way back from 1907. But it's a real powerhouse, not just in the UK, but actually a world leader in research. And to do that, it really needs to provide the best experience for its students, but also for its researchers to ensure that they can continue to unlock what those insights they can gain from data. So I want to go back to where we started the journey with them. And this was actually back 5 years ago now, where they came with a vision to transform into a world-leading digital university experience. So really thinking about what is that future going to look like for a student, and how does that transpire across the full life cycle of coming to a university, really imagining creating that vision, but then building that roadmap and building blocks of how to get there. The big shift there was actually then focusing on products. So instead of saying, okay, I'm managing networks, you're managing this project here, really looking at what's that feature set, what's that value in terms of the user, and then worked backwards from there to really see that they needed this data platform that was going to power those user experiences, both for the students and the researchers, in a way that could be informed off this common data set. This also isn't easy in the context of universities, as they're highly decentralized. So that means that many faculties and departments actually spin up even their own cloud services, catch their own credit cards. It can actually be very challenging to get a unified approach. But they started on that journey and started themselves then to actually build a data platform. And we're focusing this on the 5 data domains that were most important to them. That was the research computing, the student lifecycle, digital education, the campus, as well as the business administration side of things. So the team started, and they had some fantastic folks in-house. They hadn't built this thing before in the cloud to really unify data systems, but decided to start to implement this and actually put that platform together. Where we ended up and where we got to last year is actually through this digital transformation, as well as, of course, the continued research that they're doing, the university actually climbed 8 points to number 2 the QS World University rankings. So they actually became the second best in the world. And that was a really, really big achievement for them, that they were able to power through this. I want to take a couple step back and really kind of think about the start of the journey, but also give you guys the opportunity to engage a bit. So you can put your hands up if you can relate to any of these statements. So if maybe you're a data team and you're just starting to build a data platform, I think we've had some folks who are kind of just on that journey. Maybe you've looked at different technology vendors. This particular one was Databricks. However, the likes of Microsoft Fabric and others are all actually anchoring towards the same kind of open source with Delta Lake and are already building on Medallion. I think this applies really across multiple vendors. And maybe you intend to use Medallion architecture, as that is now really the most widely used best practice for data modeling when you have both structured and unstructured data that you have to work with. And maybe the HLD has been signed off, or you've had a great proposal from some consultants. It's going to solve all your problems, and it might look something like this. So you say, great, this is fantastic. So this presents the Medallion architecture. And the Medallion is really this three-stage approach, where when you first pull the data in, you really leave it in its raw state, which you call your bronze layer. So this is where you connect your enterprise systems. You might connect your CRM, your HR systems, your finance systems, and really just pull and dump that data into a bronze layer. You then transform it into the silver layer. So this is where you say, okay, we now have, this one's in CSV, this one's, messy JSON file, but let's actually standardize that by using the same structures. So it's easier for us to integrate form calculations across those data sets together. And you build these really beautiful normalized tables in the silver layer. And those are then very well documented. They have metadata, they have a glossary, people can actually understand what's there. But then that gold layer is perhaps a particular report needs a certain number of calculations and only perhaps 10 different data fields, but from 3 different sources. That's when you'd build your tables or end products in the gold layer. And this is really what you see is that serving layer. So everything that's in gold is what is actually serving a data product that's coming out the other side. It could be a dashboard, that could be a machine learning service, or it could even be another application which needs that data and structure from multiple together. So it kind of looks simple enough. It doesn't look too different from a lot of previous concepts as well, with various staging layers. And so you think, okay, it makes a lot of sense. And often I've actually seen many technical designs that don't go a lot further than actually just showing this. So they say, great, the 250 data sources that we have, we're just going to put them really nicely into this model. But the reality is, you say, okay, let's go and look into that first system. So the HLD signed off, and the engineer now has to build this. I say, okay, let's go and look and open up and under the hood and see what's in this HR system. And they probably see something like this. So they're like, okay, fantastic. We've got 100-odd tables. How do you actually go from what is mapped here into that simple medallion structure? And this is really where we see most projects fall down that try to adopt this, is they haven't actually thought through what it's going to take to really normalize this and bring it together. And without that, you don't have the knowledge that you need to know how long things are going to take, but also what's that best strategy going to be in that low-level design to make sure that if one file isn't loading correctly, the full pipeline doesn't break and everything doesn't load. So that's the situation really when we started with Imperial, is they had laid those first foundations, they had built this platform, but they were seeing that as they had more and more sources that they onboarded, they were actually seeing a huge volume of production issues. So the data platform was down and the team was spending a lot of time on trying to fix those issues instead of actually being able to onboard new data or to curate that data for other teams. So it was getting slower and slower because it was growing in this complexity, and there were so many intricacies between the pipelines that they were failing, and it wasn't really having that impact or allowing them to work on those next stages. So some of those, we joined at that stage. They said, okay, they'd built that first foundation, but they wanted some senior data engineering and architecture support. So we joined their team and we did a review of the architecture, really working hand in hand. So we were working inside Imperial College London, part of the team, to really firstly understand what they'd done, the current state, but then actually work together to implement the target state, that they would have that knowledge and then could hire their own ongoing team to fill some of those gaps and really own it in-house, which was their ambition. So one of the first challenges that we found was there was inconsistent usage of the layers. So what that means, if we skip back to the medallion architecture, is that some dashboards and reports were actually connecting directly to the silver layer. Because they only needed a table that was already there, they thought, great, let's just hook it up straight into that silver layer, and that's simpler than having to move it to gold. What that means is that if something fails or goes wrong, or even if you just have to update or transform that silver layer because of some other change, that you're actually constrained because that is now supporting live services. So that became a real issue, that they couldn't implement the transformations and ongoing changes that they had to, because production services were actually reaching back to silver as well. Another challenge was user demand and the governance around that. So there was a lot of demand for this data, and that really caused a lot of impact in having to push things live very quickly, as there wasn't a very clear and consistent way of how they should engage, how should their requests get prioritized, and who actually are those data product owners. I can talk a bit about that later as well, in terms of what is that model that they got to in how that governance is managed. The other piece is there was a huge amount of variance in data structures, but also access management. So what that meant is that some structures were, again, thinking back to, is it CSV, is it JSON, is it Delta? They had many different types of structures around that, but we're also missing some standards so that engineers knew what is the convention, what is the way that I should actually try to normalize these schemas, really so that that data is interoperable, but also so that anyone coming and working on the platform knows what to expect and can actually learn it a lot faster without having to rely on that tribal and historical knowledge of, okay, I know this one is CSV, I know this one's a bit funny because of X system. You really reduce a lot of that once you have some clear standards around how should you describe data, what should you expect in the format, and how do you really structure that in a way that others can understand without a lot of hand-holding. Some of the solutions that we implemented, the first one is that strict layer separation. So if anything was production, only connecting that to the gold tables. The second was developing a suite of standards for the usage of data catalogs and monitoring compliance with that. And one of the kind of tooling capabilities that enabled that in Databricks is called the Unity catalog. And that's actually an open source model, only since June last year. So that can connect to any source, regardless if it's AWS, Azure, Fabric, etc., and provides a data catalog, essentially, that describes what that data is, both in business terms, but also in technical terms. One of my favorite new features there is they have AI embedded. So a catalog might sound really simple, but often when you see tables of data, the headers might be things like C2 or SAP_35. Once you actually look at that database sort of column naming convention, and that doesn't really mean anything to anyone. But as a result, the engineers don't know, what data is this? What story does it tell? How does it fit with anything else? And equally, the analysts on the other side can't make sense of it. So a catalog makes sure that there's actually business definitions. And the Unity catalog has this great feature where it uses AI to automatically populate the definitions. And I think that's powerful, not because it always gets it right, but because it makes it easier to get the domain experts to respond. Often, if you say, here's a data catalog, you're the expert of finance, write down what all of these fields mean, you're not going to get a response. That's never going to be high on their priority list, unless, of course, there's, some strict conversations about priorities and resource. But the power of saying, here's a draft, can you correct or review it, really often triggers a response that's quite sort of connected to us, that if something's in our area, we want to make sure it's right. We want to correct things and we want to make sure that they're going to be representative. So it can speed things up in terms of the time it takes to write it. I think the biggest pace impact is actually on triggering that response and getting that engagement from people to provide or review those descriptions. Okay. So that's also best practice I'd recommend for anyone starting out on a data platform journey, is really think about the catalog element and how and where you're going to manage the metadata that describes the data sets when they arrive, who they belong to at the start. So if you don't do that at the start, you're again at risk of coming into some of these issues further down the line. The other piece was separating the environments by data domain. So what we found is that the environments were maintaining a large volume of pipelines. So overall, the solution had 113 pipelines. A single environment had a huge proportion of those, and they're very tightly coupled, which really means if one piece of it falls down, the rest of it falls down as well. Not a lot of resilience in there. So we separated that into each of those 5 domains that you see here on the right. So each of those had their own environment, their own quality indicators, and that was also linked back to a domain owner. So there was an individual at the university who was the data owner for each of those domains and was responsible that the glossary was there, the standards were defined, but also they were liaising with their counterparts to agree on what data assets and reports and ML products they needed from the data platform team. So that's actually quite different to a lot of models where you might have data owners who are business teams completely separate to a data platform team. Actually having the one person who's responsible for the data ownership and quality side, but also the delivery and defining requirements of the data products meant that they could balance any quality issues, but with what is needed to come down that line next. So you had that single point of contact who could really balance the quality with the product demands. The final piece was decoupling pipelines wherever possible. So what we did here is develop the pipelines in a way that they were based on a single trigger. So taking a trigger and event-driven approach. That's a little bit kind of lower level in terms of the architecture and engineering side. So won't go too deep into that unless anyone's interested. But really ensuring that if one event failed, it would only fail the data that's directly related to that event, instead of making all of the other data sets and systems fail. So as a result, we have these 113 pipelines that are in production, serving 30 different data products. Actually saw 98% reduction in incidents. So whilst that's incredible for the users, it also meant that the team could then actually spend their time on onboarding new data sets and improving the platform instead of just being caught up and trying to manage those issues. Overall, it also gave them that enhanced data governance. They now have that catalog. They can actually view and manage their access. But it also streamlined how easy it is for people to use the data within that. Because the catalog, it doesn't only sort of give you a list of those data sets, but it actually incorporates your permissions. So we defined very clear role-based access controls and incorporated them to the Unity catalog. So that meant that a new engineer, a new analyst, they could log in, they could see the data, they could already access data that they should have the right to access depending on their role. And they didn't have to go and copy secrets or keys from different locations. That's all actually natively embedded within the tool itself. The other piece is flexibility. So what that really meant is that when there were changes in the source system, so say someone makes a major change to that finance system, you could actually have quickly adapt the data platform to manage that without disrupting pipelines. You can almost think of that as self-healing. Instead of having to go and re-architect the full pipeline, that it was able to handle those changes because of the way that that schema standard was set. And finally, of course, the improved stability that comes with just being able to ensure that you have as robust approach as you can on decoupling the pipelines and reducing the dependencies there. So I want to leave you with three main takeaways. The first is really invest the time in the data discovery and architecture to develop the standards that you're going to use for your data model, your pipelines and environments, and really think about what are the key data domains that are important for your organization and how does the architecture underpin that. So if you're having teams present back to you, you can really ask them that question to say, okay, but how does this actually map to our data domains? Which data domains do we have? If you're a beauty company, they might look very different to if you're a university or if you're running a pension system. So understanding what those data domains are and also how mature the organization is in terms of ownership there is really going to help you understand how big is that journey that you have to go on. And we've worked with some organizations where the biggest challenge actually to go live with a new government service was they couldn't find the people to describe what that data actually means. They thought they might have interpreted it right, but there's billions of different records. And actually finding the owner who's the authority on that source was a big blocker to going live. The other piece is once you understand those data domains, ensure the architecture is actually going to take that into account so that you separate those and you can monitor the quality on it and give that constant feedback back to the data owners, domain owners, for them to really manage the quality, because it's up to the data owners to actually take action there, ensure that the source systems are correct, or that they can provide you the logic that you need to build into the platform. The other piece is set standards for data catalogs. So really from the start, being clear on what are those standards going to be. For example, what are the fields that we see as mandatory? Do we need to know who last updated the data? Do we need to know who created it, when they created it, what schema is expected with this data? But really investing that time to set those standards from the start makes sure that it's actually a valuable asset over time. And finally is really managing those user expectations. So also thinking through what is that request fulfillment process? So when new demand comes down the pipeline, where does that get logged and tracked? Sorry, just give me one moment. And who prioritizes those requests as well? You can have that clear understanding of how various pieces come through. The other piece is actually being very mindful of the terminology and language that you use, because when you talk about a data platform, it's quite easy for people to think, okay, that's a technology thing, and that message is going to stick, and that's going to be the reputation of the program, and the business might be sort of arm's length away, thinking that's a tech thing, you've got to go build your fancy platform. But it's really about thinking about what is a powerful name that's actually going to link it back to the purpose of the organization or the purpose of the data products that you're building there specifically. So think about that name, think about the words that you're going to use when you're communicating it to users, to leaders, to ensure that it's really setting that clear message and planting that seed in their mind that actually the business owns this and it's an asset for the business, but actually pulls in just how important that part of the work is. Because technology, unless they're really embedded in the business and understand the service and the users and the data, you can't really do it on your own. You need that buy-in, you need that engagement and support. So that takes us up to the end already. We do have time for some questions. If anyone has, checking if something's come through the chat. Great. All right, Liz, you want to kick us off?
Hi, thank you. That was really interesting. I just wondered whether you think it will be challenging for Imperial College to manage that transition when your engagement with them ends. I know you mentioned that they've been or they will be hiring to fill those skills gaps, but what's your experience of that transition?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we had a gradual transition, and actually as of January, on the data platform team, we have now fully left. We're still working with them in other areas and have those relationships. So we're hearing that it's been a successful transition, but the way that it was done was quite gradual. So that whilst we first had multiple engineers and architects, we faded those out over time, whilst their team faded in as well. So it was a blended team from the start, where they had their own product owner, they had their own delivery manager, and they had one junior engineer. But then over time, as they added new folks, we worked together and had a gradual transition.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks.
And Marta asked a couple of questions in the chat. Marta, do you want to come off mute and ask them, or should I?
Yeah, that's fine. I can ask them. So there are a few actually questions I have. So first, you've mentioned about AI tools generating the definition. So I wonder how accurate this is, because I struggle with accuracy, especially with AI, generative AI implemented in the tools.
Yeah, it's a great question. The accuracy depends a lot on the quality of the data. So if the columns are already described quite clearly, if it says, account manager's name, then AI is usually very good at providing a description. Might still need to be reviewed in your context. However, if a column name is Kimball_C1, it's not going to have much of a chance. But I found that it's almost just as powerful to have an inaccurate draft, because as the tech person, it's not your responsibility to write that business glossary. It's the business's responsibility. So if you have some draft where you say, this could be totally wrong, but here's a starter for 10, you tell me what's right. And it helps to trigger their thinking and get it going, instead of just a big, empty table for them to fill out, which never gets done.
And actually that's very good. And it leads to my second question, because what I find out, the data quality that is implemented is not necessarily through the company, but people working for the company. And I wonder how to empower the data owners to get better data for the systems.
Yeah, that's definitely not an easy one to do, because that takes that buy-in from the top. So what we do sometimes with companies who are about to start on a data platform is we actually have a full day workshop with their leadership teams, so that they can come together and just level set on some of these topics, understand the 101s, understand the different parts and why it's important. Otherwise, it's so abstract. I had a CEO say to me once, she's like, Silvia, is this data platform, is it not really getting, have you faced some challenges here? Because, people just find it boring. So it takes something to actually bring it to life and to bring people in a room and get everyone talking about it, surface any fears and concerns, make it safe for them to ask any question. This is a world that's developing quickly. We don't all have the same level of data and technology understanding, but actually building that kind of culture as a team. Firstly, the technical learning is important, but it's almost just building that culture across leaders and gaining their hearts and minds. Maybe a side conversation as well, if you notice that some people are more resistant. to understand some of their concerns, but just building that trust and building that team, I think is a powerful lever. And then, of course, there's the more practical side of making their roles and responsibilities super clear. Sometimes if we're presenting the sort of things to an executive team, instead of talking about data governance, we'll say, we need to answer questions like, who decides when this data can be deleted? Who decides who can access this data? Who decides what hash code risk actually means? But just making it very simple and just starting with what are those critical responsibilities and how they'd be measured. And then that support, even from management, even from HR, to say, okay, in your individual performance objectives, data quality across this data domain of student research or wherever it is, and these, you need to define the quality metrics and then report against those as well, really creating it as part of the lifeblood of their role in their day-to-day.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Sheree, your hand is up.
Yes. So my question is, I have two questions, first of all. So the first question is, in my last company, I got the chance of creating this whole data governance, team, and then appointing the data stewards, data owners, data, heads, and who would be responsible and all the timely meetings. And I firsthand know that it is a very, very difficult task to get everything and everybody in one place, especially from different departments and everyone, and agreeing to the standards, maintaining one data format for whole of the company. So I just wanted to know that, yes, Imperial is a very big company, as you're telling, and they have different things. And I could see that how the data was distributed before you went in. So what are the bigger challenges that you have faced when setting up, especially the data governance or the data security or data quality issues? Have you trained them on those levels as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the main challenges is you can never get 100% of data governance 100%. It's impossible that your data is always going to be perfect in every corner. When it comes to the standards, what we've sometimes done, unless we're doing an enterprise data architecture piece, but we still accept that different systems will have different formats, how they're storing the data. And where we want to create that standardization is actually once we've extracted it and dumped it into the data platform. Because at least here in the context of data platforms, it's about how can that data be used together so you can create the right joins, the right summarizations. So in a way, the data owners on the business side don't need to know about that. That's something for the data engineers and the platform team to find a standard that's going to allow them to build the outputs that the business need.
And the second question is, I heard that you have integrated the AI tools as well, right? So how do we make sure that, the AI tools are following all the guidelines, safety, fairness, reliability, and everything? So have you given any training to them, or do they hire somebody from their side?
Yeah, that's a very good question as well. So when it comes to some AI features within the platforms, there it's about trusting your vendor and doing the right due diligence to make sure that you can rely on them. So the one that I mentioned here is actually part of the platform. It's part of the Databricks ecosystem. And equally, if you're in Fabric, you have the Fabric Copilot and the AI skills, and that's embedded.
Guys everywhere.
However, you have to be cautious with how you use them, and you have to ensure that you've done those right controls. And equally, when we're talking about, for example, here, generating the example glossaries, we're still asking the experts to sign it off. So it's about understanding what's the right use of AI for the problem. Is it a scenario that you can let AI do it end to end and be comfortable with the risks and understand how much it's performing? Or do you need a human in the loop? And even if a human is in the loop, how do you train them to be able to still catch the errors? There have been some interesting examples where doctors, for example, get a summary from an interaction they've had with the patient. And so they check it and they're like, yeah, that's right, that's right, that's right, that's right. By the time they've got to the 98th one and it's been right 98 times, it's actually wrong and they don't see it. Because it's always performing and maybe just once or twice get something wrong, it's actually harder to track this. So that's where, if you're actually developing your own machine learning models or using those models for your systems, having the right AI guardrails is very important. And that can look like, essentially, when you have a response, a way to validate that and check that. In AWS, they've just released an incredibly advanced technique. There's some that are simpler than others, where it's actually using a different kind of AI to check it. So you can have one AI that develops the output and another which is called automated reasoning. And it converts policy documents into a set of mathematical rules. So it's not using generative AI that can hallucinate and make things up, but it's actually generating a rule set. And it even converts that mathematical logic into plain English or plain whichever language you're speaking. So you can check that those rules are correct. And each time you have a Gen AI model or some other system saying, answering an HR query about a policy, it then actually go and fact check that against the hard logic and can tell it to go and revise that statement. It's a very large topic in itself, and has to be taken into the context of just how far you're going. I think we've got one question in the chat as well. How do you filter data to ensure GDPR? Another very good question. And this also ties back to that data governance piece. So for example, when you're creating your data catalog and creating your data variables, best practices to actually tag different data with the types that it is. So if you have personal identifiable data, which is what applies to GDPR, you would then create a tag against those fields so it could more easily be found. There's also some automated tools in that space, data governance tools like Microsoft Purview, where it can automatically scan your data assets and give you that map view and say, okay, you've got 2 million instances of names here, you've got medical data over there, and that's really based on regex rules and expected formats when it's scanning the data.
Ace, any more questions before we close? I think everybody's had their chance. Some really great questions there. Thank you, Silvia. Really great insight there. And I love the fact that it's linked to a real life delivery. It's not all theoretical. So I think it makes it a lot easier for people to digest and understand. So without further ado, just to say thank you very much for your time. Thanks for everyone that attended. We are hoping to have these sessions at least once a month with a variety of speakers. So please keep an eye out for the follow-up sessions. And I'll see you all soon.
Brilliant. Thanks for having me.